The morning fog hung heavy over the grounds of Ashworth Palace as Dr. Helena Morrison hurried through the marble corridors, her heels clicking against the polished floors. She had been the royal physician for nearly 15 years, but the urgency in today's summons felt different. The message had been brief and cryptic. His Majesty requires immediate consultation. Utmost discretion required. King Alexander III sat in his private study, surrounded by centuries-old paintings of his ancestors. At 68, he still carried himself with the dignity that had defined his 30-year reign, but Dr. Morrison noticed immediately that something had changed. His usually sharp blue eyes seemed distant, and there was a tremor in his left hand as he reached for his teacup. "Your Majesty," Dr. Morrison began, setting down her medical bag on the antique desk. "You mentioned experiencing some concerning symptoms?" The king hesitated, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his weathered features. "Helena, what I'm about to tell you must remain between us for now. The stability of the kingdom may depend on it." Dr. Morrison had heard similar words before during various royal health crises, but the gravity in the king's voice sent a chill down her spine. "Of course, Your Majesty. You have my complete confidentiality." Alexander stood slowly, his movements more deliberate than usual. "For the past month, I've been experiencing episodes of confusion. Yesterday, I couldn't remember my youngest daughter's name for nearly an hour. This morning, I found myself in the garden wearing only my night clothes, with no memory of how I got there." The physician's training kicked in immediately. She began her examination while carefully observing the king's behavior and speech patterns. His blood pressure was elevated, and she noticed a slight asymmetry in his facial expressions that hadn't been present during his last routine checkup 6 months ago. "Have you experienced any headaches, dizziness, or changes in vision?" she asked, making notes in her secure tablet. "Headaches, yes. Severe ones, usually in the early morning. And sometimes I see shadows moving in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, nothing's there." Dr. Morrison's clinical mind was already considering possibilities, none of them favorable. The combination of symptoms pointed toward several serious neurological conditions, each carrying its own devastating implications for both the king personally and the monarchy as an institution. As she continued her examination, the king spoke quietly about the pressures he'd been facing. The recent economic crisis had strained relationships with Parliament, and there were growing calls for constitutional reforms that would further limit royal power. His eldest son, Prince William, had been pushing for more involvement in state affairs, sensing that changes were coming. "I've been wondering if the stress is finally catching up to me," Alexander admitted. 43 years of public service, countless state dinners, diplomatic crises, family scandals splashed across every tabloid. "Perhaps my mind is simply tired." Dr. Morrison completed her initial examination and sat across from the king in one of the leather chairs that had witnessed countless private conversations between monarchs and their trusted advisors. "Your Majesty, I need to be direct with you. The symptoms you're describing require immediate and comprehensive investigation. I'm recommending a full neurological workup, including advanced imaging studies." The king's expression remained stoic, though his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the arms of his chair. "And what might we be looking for exactly?" "Several possibilities need to be ruled out. Early-stage dementia, the effects of small strokes, or potentially a neurological condition that could be treatable if caught early. Without proper testing, I cannot provide you with an accurate diagnosis." Alexander was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the gardens where tourists gathered daily, hoping to catch a glimpse of royal life. "You understand the implications of what you're suggesting. If word were to leak about any serious cognitive issues, the constitutional crisis would be unprecedented," Dr. Morrison finished. "I understand completely. That's why I'm recommending we conduct all testing at a private facility under assumed names. We can arrange everything through secure channels." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. "Enter," the king called, and his private secretary, Margaret Whitmore, stepped in. She had served the royal family for over 2 decades and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was amiss. Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption. Prince William is here for your scheduled meeting regarding the Commonwealth Summit preparations. Dr. Morrison saw the brief flash of panic cross the king's face before he composed himself. Of course. Please tell him I'll be with him momentarily. After Margaret left, Alexander turned back to the physician. Helena, I need to ask something difficult of you. How long do we have before any decline might become noticeable to others? The question hung in the air like a sword. Dr. Morrison had treated many patients facing similar uncertainties, but never one whose cognitive health could potentially affect the stability of an entire nation. That depends entirely on what we're dealing with. Some conditions progress slowly over years, others more rapidly. Without a diagnosis, I cannot give you a timeline. Very well. Arrange whatever testing you feel is necessary. But, Helena, the king's voice carried the weight of his office. Until we know exactly what we're facing, this conversation never happened. The Royal Physician's Code of Silence has never been more critical. As Dr. Morrison gathered her equipment, she couldn't help but think about the enormous responsibility that had just been placed on her shoulders. The health of the monarchy itself might depend on her ability to navigate the coming medical investigation with absolute secrecy. The king straightened his tie and prepared to meet with his son, slipping back into the role he had perfected over decades of public life. But Dr. Morrison noticed the way he paused at the mirror near the door, studying his reflection as if trying to memorize the man looking back at him. Prince William entered the study 15 minutes later, his tall frame filling the doorway. At 45, he had grown into his role as heir apparent, showing the same dedication to duty that had defined his father's reign. But today, he seemed more observant than usual. Father, you look tired. Are you feeling well? The king forced a smile. Just the usual pressures of office, my boy. Nothing that a good night's sleep won't cure. They discussed the upcoming Commonwealth Summit, reviewing security protocols and diplomatic priorities. But William couldn't shake the feeling that his father seemed distracted, occasionally losing his train of thought mid-sentence or asking him to repeat information they had just discussed. Perhaps we should postpone some of your upcoming engagements, William suggested carefully. You've been maintaining an exhausting schedule. Nonsense, Alexander replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. The people depend on the crown's presence. We cannot show weakness, especially with all the Republican sentiment growing in the polls. After William left, the king sat alone in his study as afternoon shadows lengthened across the room. He picked up a photograph of his late wife, Queen Catherine, who had died 3 years earlier after a brief battle with cancer. He wondered what she would have advised in this situation. She had always been his closest confidant, the one person who could cut through royal protocol to give him honest guidance. Now, facing what might be the greatest crisis of his reign, he felt more alone than ever. The irony wasn't lost on him that while millions of people looked up to him as a symbol of stability and continuity, he was possibly facing a condition that would rob him of the very mental faculties that made him capable of serving them. Dr. Morrison spent the evening making discreet phone calls to specialists she trusted implicitly. Dr. James Carrington, a neurologist at the prestigious Harley Medical Center, had treated several high-profile patients over the years and understood the need for absolute confidentiality. Dr. Sarah Chun, a neuropsychologist, specialized in early detection of cognitive disorders and had developed protocols for testing patients whose cases required extraordinary discretion. By midnight, she had arranged for a comprehensive evaluation to take place the following weekend at a private clinic outside London. The king would be registered under the name Mr. A. Windsor, a thin disguise that would satisfy administrative requirements while maintaining plausible deniability. As she prepared for bed, Dr. Morrison reflected on the strange turn her career had taken. She had entered medicine to help people, but she had never imagined that one patient's diagnosis could potentially reshape the political landscape of an entire nation. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Prince William was having his own sleepless night. He had noticed subtle changes in his father's behavior over the past few months, but had attributed them to stress and age. Tonight, However, those concerns felt more pressing. His father had always been sharp, decisive, capable of remembering the smallest details about state affairs and personal conversations. The man he had met with today seemed somehow diminished, as if operating through a haze that hadn't been there before. William's wife, Princess Catherine, found him standing at their bedroom window, looking out at the palace grounds. "You're worried about your father." It wasn't a question. After 15 years of marriage, she had learned to read his moods with the same precision that courtiers read changes in royal protocol. "Something's not right," William admitted. "He's not himself lately. More forgetful, sometimes confused about details he would normally remember perfectly. And today, when we were discussing the Commonwealth Summit, I had to repeat several points that we had literally just covered." Catherine joined him at the window. "Have you spoken to him directly about your concerns? You know how he is about appearing weak or vulnerable. The crown doesn't show uncertainty. But, Catherine, if there's something seriously wrong." The implications hung unspoken between them. William had been preparing for eventual succession his entire life, but always with the assumption that it would come naturally through age and gradual transition. The possibility of suddenly inheriting the throne due to his father's declining health was something entirely different. Back in the king's private quarters, Alexander lay awake reviewing the events of the day. He tried to focus on the conversation with Dr. Morrison, testing his memory against the growing fear that his mind was betraying him. The details were clear now in the quiet darkness of his room, but he couldn't shake the anxiety about what tomorrow might bring. He thought about his grandfather, King George VI, who had faced his own health crisis while leading the nation through World War II. But that had been a physical ailment, a stutter, and lung problems that, while challenging, hadn't threatened his mental capacity to rule. What Alexander potentially faced was far more insidious, a condition that could gradually strip away the very essence of who he was while leaving his body intact. The next morning brought a full schedule of royal duties. The king had a ceremony honoring veterans, followed by a meeting with the prime minister to discuss economic policy, and an evening reception for visiting dignitaries from Japan. Dr. Morrison watched from a distance as he navigated each event, noting moments when he seemed to hesitate or rely more heavily on his staff for prompts. During the veteran ceremony, she observed him struggle briefly to remember the name of a war hero he had personally decorated just 2 years earlier. At the diplomatic reception, he told the same anecdote twice to the same group of guests, seemingly unaware of the repetition. These were subtle signs that might be dismissed as minor fatigue by casual observers, but Dr. Morrison's trained, I recognized them as potentially significant markers of cognitive decline. The urgency of getting a proper diagnosis grew with each passing hour. As the weekend approached, both the king and Dr. Morrison prepared for what might be the most important medical appointment in recent royal history. The results of the upcoming tests would not only determine Alexander's personal future, but could potentially trigger constitutional changes that would reverberate through British society for generations to come. The crown had weathered many storms over its 1,000-year history, but none quite like this, where the very mind that bore its weight might be slipping away, one memory at a time. The private clinic outside London appeared unremarkable from the road, a converted Victorian mansion that could have housed any number of discreet medical practices. Dr. Morrison had chosen Greenvale Medical Center specifically for its reputation of serving high-profile clients who valued privacy above all else. The facility's owner, Dr. Patricia Wells, had once treated members of Parliament, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries, all of whom required absolute confidentiality. King Alexander arrived at dawn on Saturday morning, traveling in an unmarked vehicle driven by his most trusted security officer, Commander David Ross. The king wore casual clothing, dark slacks, and a simple sweater that made him nearly unrecognizable from his usual formal appearances. Even so, he kept his head down as they entered through a rear entrance that had been cleared of all other staff. Dr. Morrison met them in a private consultation room, decorated more like a comfortable sitting room than a medical facility. "Your Majesty, thank you for trusting me with this process. I want to assure you that everyone involved in today's evaluation has signed additional confidentiality agreements beyond their professional obligations." The king nodded, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. Let's proceed. I'd prefer to know what we're dealing with as quickly as possible. Dr. James Carrington arrived precisely at 7 a.m. A distinguished neurologist in his late 50s, he had built his reputation on both his medical expertise and his discretion. He had treated several members of parliament and had once consulted on a case involving a European ambassador who had suffered a stroke during delicate treaty negotiations. Mr. Windsor, Dr. Carrington said, using the agreed-upon alias, I understand you've been experiencing some concerning symptoms. Dr. Morrison has briefed me on the general situation, but I'd like to hear directly from you about what you've been experiencing. For the next hour, the king described his symptoms in detail. The morning confusion, the memory gaps, the episodes of finding himself in locations with no recollection of how he had arrived there. Dr. Carrington listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting specific examples. Have you noticed any changes in your sleep patterns? The neurologist asked. I've been having vivid, disturbing dreams. Sometimes I wake up unsure if what I remember was a dream or something that actually happened. Just last week, I was convinced I had attended a state dinner with the president of France, but my secretary informed me that meeting had been canceled months ago. Dr. Carrington and Dr. Morrison exchanged a meaningful glance. The blurring of dreams and reality was another concerning symptom that pointed towards several serious neurological conditions. The first phase of testing began with a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Sarachin. She led the king through a series of cognitive assessments designed to measure memory, attention, language skills, and executive function. Some tests seemed almost insultingly simple, repeating lists of words, drawing clock faces, identifying objects and photographs. Others were more complex, requiring him to solve puzzles or recall detailed stories after listening to them once. I feel like a school child being tested, the king confided to Dr. Morrison during a break. Though I must admit, some of those tasks were more challenging than I expected. The morning concluded with a detailed MRI scan. The king lay still in the machine for nearly 2 hours as it captured high-resolution images of his brain from every possible angle. Dr. Carrington had specifically requested additional sequences that would help identify subtle changes in brain structure and blood flow. While they waited for preliminary results, the king found himself in the unusual position of having nothing official to do. For a man whose every minute was typically scheduled months in advance, the empty hours felt strange and unsettling. I keep thinking about my father, he told Dr. Morrison as they sat in the quiet consultation room. He lived to be 91 and remained sharp until the very end. I always assumed I would follow the same pattern. The idea that my mind might fail before my body feels like a betrayal of everything I was raised to expect. Dr. Morrison had counseled many patients through similar fears, but she recognized that the king's situation was unique. For most people, cognitive decline was a personal tragedy that affected their family and immediate circle. For a reigning monarch, it was a matter of national significance. Whatever we discover today, she said carefully, we need to remember that early detection often provides more treatment options. Many conditions that cause cognitive symptoms can be managed or slowed significantly with proper care. By late afternoon, Dr. Carrington had reviewed the initial imaging results, and Dr. Chun had completed her analysis of the neuropsychological testing. They requested a private meeting with Dr. Morrison before speaking with the king. The news is mixed, Dr. Carrington began, his expression grave. The MRI shows several areas of concern. There's evidence of small vessel disease, essentially reduced blood flow to certain regions of the brain. We also found what appear to be early signs of protein deposits that are associated with certain degenerative conditions. Dr. Chen opened her tablet and displayed a summary of the cognitive testing results. The neuropsychological evaluation confirms that there are measurable deficits in several areas. His working memory and executive function show patterns consistent with early-stage cognitive impairment. The good news is that his overall intellectual capacity remains high, and Many areas of function appear normal. Dr. Morrison felt her heart sink. Are we looking at Alzheimer's disease? It's too early to make that specific diagnosis, Dr. Carrington replied. The findings are consistent with what we call mild cognitive impairment, which can be a precursor to Alzheimer's, but it could also represent other conditions. Some forms of cognitive impairment remain stable for years, while others progress more rapidly. The three physicians discussed treatment options and monitoring protocols before agreeing that it was time to speak with the king. Alexander was sitting by the window when they entered, watching the late afternoon shadows lengthen across the clinic's garden. "Your expressions tell me this isn't good news," he said without turning around. Dr. Carrington chose his words carefully. "Your Majesty, the testing has confirmed that you are experiencing mild cognitive impairment. This represents a level of cognitive decline that goes beyond normal aging, but hasn't yet reached the threshold of dementia." The king was silent for several minutes, processing the information. "What does this mean for my ability to fulfill my duties as sovereign?" "That depends on several factors, including how quickly the condition progresses and what additional treatments we can implement," Dr. Morrison explained. "With proper medical management, many people with mild cognitive impairment can continue to function effectively for years. But it will progress," the king stated. It wasn't a question. "Not necessarily," Dr. Chun interjected. "Some patients remain stable at this level for a decade or more. Others may see improvement with treatment. However, I must be honest, there is a significant risk that the symptoms will worsen over time." The king finally turned to face them. "How long do we have before the decline becomes noticeable to others?" Dr. Carrington had anticipated this question. "Given your high level of cognitive reserve and the demands of your position, you may be able to compensate for these deficits for several years. However, we would recommend close monitoring and possibly beginning to delegate some responsibilities gradually. And if the press or parliament were to learn of this diagnosis..." The physicians exchanged glances. None of them were constitutional experts, but they all understood the potential ramifications. "That would be a matter for constitutional lawyers and advisors to address," Dr. Morrison said diplomatically. The king stood and walked to the window again. "I need to ask something of all of you. This information cannot leave this room until I decide how to proceed. The stability of the monarchy may depend on managing this revelation carefully." Over the following week, the king maintained his regular schedule while privately grappling with his diagnosis. Dr. Morrison had prescribed several medications that might slow the progression of his cognitive decline and recommended lifestyle changes, including increased physical exercise and cognitive stimulation activities. The hardest part was maintaining the facade of normalcy, while knowing that each public appearance might be one step closer to the day when his condition could no longer be hidden. During a state dinner with visiting African heads of state, he found himself relying more heavily on written notes and had to discreetly ask his private secretary to remind him of names he should have known automatically. Prince William began noticing more concerning signs. During their weekly private meeting to discuss royal duties, he observed his father struggling to follow complex policy discussions and occasionally asking questions about topics they had just covered. The prince's concern grew, but he hesitated to address it directly, unsure whether his observations were accurate or influenced by his own anxiety about eventual succession. "I think we need to have a family meeting," William confided to his wife after a particularly troubling conversation with his father about upcoming Commonwealth obligations. "Something is definitely wrong, and I'm concerned about his ability to handle the demands of his office." Princess Catherine had noticed changes too, particularly during family gatherings where the king seemed less engaged and occasionally confused about recent events involving his grandchildren. "Have you considered approaching Dr. Morrison? She might be able to provide some insight without violating any confidentialities." Meanwhile, Dr. Morrison was developing a careful monitoring protocol that would allow her to track the king's cognitive status without arousing suspicion. She arranged for more frequent routine health checkups and implemented subtle cognitive assessments that could be integrated into normal conversations. The king's private secretary, Margaret Whitmore, was perhaps the person best positioned to observe changes in his daily functioning. She had begun to notice that he required more reminders about appointments, and sometimes seemed confused about the purpose of meetings. Her decades of service had taught her to adapt quietly to any royal peculiarities, but these changes felt different, more concerning. "Your Majesty," she said one morning during their daily briefing, "perhaps we should consider reducing your public engagements for the next few weeks. You've been maintaining an extremely demanding schedule." The king looked at her sharply. "Do I appear unable to fulfill my duties, Margaret?" "Not all, sir. I simply thought you might benefit from a brief respite." But Margaret was troubled. She had served the royal family through various crises, and she recognized the signs of something serious developing. Her loyalty demanded that she protect the king's interests, but she wasn't sure what that meant when his condition might affect his ability to serve the nation. Dr. Morrison scheduled weekly consultations with the king under the guise of monitoring his general health following some minor cardiac irregularities, a condition that actually existed but had never required significant attention. These meetings allowed her to conduct informal cognitive assessments and adjust his medications as needed. "I've been having more difficulty with names," the king admitted during one of these sessions. "Yesterday, I couldn't remember my youngest grandson's name for nearly 10 minutes. And I've started keeping notes about conversations because I'm not confident I'll remember them later." These are strategies that many people with similar conditions find helpful, Dr. Morrison assured him. Maintaining written records and using memory aids aren't signs of failure. They're smart adaptations to cognitive changes. 3 weeks after his diagnosis, the king faced his most challenging test yet, a live television interview about the upcoming Commonwealth Summit. The interview was supposed to last 30 minutes and cover complex international relations topics that required detailed knowledge of multiple countries' political situations. Dr. Morrison watched the broadcast from her office, noting several moments where the king paused longer than normal or provided answers that seemed slightly off target. To most viewers, he appeared as dignified and knowledgeable as ever, but she could see the subtle signs of his cognitive struggles. The interview concluded successfully, but Dr. Morrison knew they were approaching a critical decision point. How much longer could the king's condition remain hidden? And what would happen when concealment was no longer possible? That evening, the king called an emergency meeting with Dr. Morrison. "Helena, I need to discuss something with you. Today's interview made me realize that we're walking on very thin ice. If I were to have a significant cognitive episode during a public appearance, the damage to the monarchy could be irreparable." Dr. Morrison had been anticipating this conversation. "What are you considering, Your Majesty?" "I think it may be time to begin preparing for the possibility that I will need to step back from my duties sooner rather than later. But before we cross that bridge, I need to have a conversation with William. He needs to understand what's happening." The decision to tell Prince William would mark a turning point in the crisis. Once the heir apparent knew about his father's condition, the machinery of constitutional change would begin to move, even if slowly and secretly. The crown's greatest challenge in generations was about to enter a new phase, where medical reality would collide with political necessity in ways that no one could fully predict. The library at Balmoral Castle had always been King Alexander's favorite retreat. Surrounded by thousands of books collected by generations of his family, it felt like the most private place in his very public world. He had chosen this room for what might be the most difficult conversation of his reign, telling his eldest son and heir about the diagnosis that could change everything. Prince William arrived on a gray Thursday morning in November, assuming this was another routine discussion about royal duties. He found his father standing by the fireplace, staring into flames that cast dancing shadows across the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. "Father, you asked to see me privately?" The king gestured to 2 chairs positioned near the fire. "Sit, William. We need to discuss something of utmost importance." As they settled into the familiar chairs where they had shared countless conversations over the years, William noticed his father's hands trembling slightly. The king, usually so composed and direct, seemed to be struggling with how to begin. "William, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but you must know. The future of the monarchy may depend on how we handle this information. Alexander paused, gathering his thoughts. For several months, I've been experiencing concerning health symptoms. Dr. Morrison has conducted extensive testing, and the results indicate that I'm in the early stages of cognitive decline. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. William felt his world shift fundamentally in the space of a few seconds. He had been preparing his entire life for eventual succession, but always with the assumption that it would come through natural aging and gradual transition. Now, how serious is it? William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The medical term is mild cognitive impairment. It means my memory and thinking abilities are declining beyond normal aging, but I haven't yet reached the stage of dementia. However, there's a significant risk that it will progress to more serious conditions like Alzheimer's disease. William struggled to process this information. His father had always seemed invincible, the eternal constant in a changing world. The idea that this strength was being eroded from within felt almost impossible to accept. What does this mean for your ability to reign? That's what we need to discuss. Dr. Morrison believes I may be able to continue my duties for some time, possibly years, with proper medical management and careful monitoring. But, William, we must acknowledge that there will likely come a point when I can no longer fulfill my responsibilities as sovereign. The prince stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Scottish countryside that had been in his family for generations. How long have you known? I was officially diagnosed 3 weeks ago, but I've been experiencing symptoms for several months. The morning confusion, memory gaps, difficulty following complex discussions. I had hoped it was merely stress or fatigue. And you've told no one else? Only Dr. Morrison and the specialists involved in my diagnosis. You're the first family member to know. William turned back to face his father. What about Mother's wishes? She always said the crown should serve the people's interests above all else. If you're no longer able to serve effectively. Alexander's expression grew pained. Your mother would have wanted me to put duty before personal comfort, you're right. But, William, the transition of power is extraordinarily complex. We cannot simply announce that the king is experiencing cognitive decline without triggering a constitutional crisis. They spent the next several hours discussing the intricate challenges they faced. The British constitutional system had no clear precedent for a monarch who was mentally competent enough to understand his condition, but possibly too impaired to execute his duties fully. Unlike a physical illness that might prevent public appearances, cognitive impairment was insidious. The king could appear functional while making decisions that might not be in the nation's best interests. We need to consult with constitutional experts, William said. Quietly, of course. We need to understand our options under both traditional precedent and modern law. The king agreed, though he worried about expanding the circle of people who knew about his condition. Every additional person who learns about this increases the risk of premature disclosure. Over the following weeks, they carefully assembled a small team of trusted advisors. Sir Geoffrey Thornton, the king's private secretary and a constitutional scholar, was brought into their confidence. Lady Elizabeth Hardcastle, who had served as the crown's legal advisor for 15 years, provided insights into the complex legal questions surrounding royal succession and capacity. The challenge, Lady Hardcastle explained during a discreet meeting at Sandringham, is that our constitutional system assumes the monarch is either fully capable or completely incapacitated. There's no framework for managing gradual cognitive decline. Sir Geoffrey had been researching historical precedents. George III's episodes of mental illness in the early 1800s led to regency arrangements, but those were temporary measures for acute conditions. What we're potentially facing is a progressive decline that could last for years. The conversations revealed the depth of constitutional uncertainty they faced. While Parliament could theoretically address the situation through legislation, any such action would require public disclosure of the king's condition. The alternative, managing the decline privately while gradually shifting duties to other family members, risked accusations of deception if the truth eventually emerged. Prince William found himself thrust into an impossible position. He had always known he would one day be king, but He had expected years of additional preparation and gradual transition. Now he faced the possibility of taking on many of his father's responsibilities while maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. "I don't feel ready," he confided to his wife during one of their private conversations. "I've been training for this my entire life, but I always assumed I'd have more time with father guiding me through the transition." Princess Catherine had watched her husband struggle with the enormous burden placed on his shoulders. "Perhaps readiness isn't something you achieve beforehand," she suggested. "Perhaps it's something you develop by rising to meet the challenges when they arise." Meanwhile, Dr. Morrison continued monitoring the king's condition through their weekly appointments. She had adjusted his medications and implemented cognitive therapy exercises designed to help maintain his mental acuity as long as possible. The king was also working with a discreet speech therapist to develop strategies for managing conversations when his memory or concentration failed. "I've been practicing responses to common questions," the king told Dr. Morrison during one of their sessions. "If I can't remember specific details during a conversation, I've learned to redirect to broader principles or ask others for clarification without appearing confused." These coping strategies worked well in controlled environments, but Dr. Morrison worried about more challenging situations. A hostile interview, an international crisis requiring immediate decisions, or simply the accumulated stress of maintaining the deception could potentially expose the king's vulnerability at the worst possible moment. The first real test came during a state visit from the president of Germany. The 3-day visit required intensive preparation, detailed knowledge of German-British trade relationships, and the ability to navigate complex conversations about European Union policies following Brexit. Dr. Morrison worked closely with the king's staff to provide additional support without making the assistance obvious. His briefing materials were reorganized to be more accessible, and his private secretary was positioned to provide subtle prompts during conversations when necessary. The state visit proceeded smoothly on the surface, but Dr. Morrison noticed several concerning moments. During a private dinner, the king asked the German president about his wife, who had died 2 years earlier. At a press conference, he briefly confused current German policies with positions the country had held a decade ago. These errors were minor enough that most observers attributed them to normal human mistakes, but Dr. Morrison recognized them as potential signs that the king's condition was progressing. She scheduled additional testing to evaluate any changes in his cognitive status. "I'm worried that the stress of maintaining normal duties while managing this condition may actually be accelerating the decline," she told Prince William during a confidential consultation. "The constant mental effort required to compensate for cognitive deficits can be exhausting." William had been conducting his own informal observations of his father's condition. During their weekly meetings, he noticed increased difficulty with complex policy discussions and occasional confusion about recent events. More troubling, the king sometimes repeated questions or made comments that didn't quite follow the conversation's logic. "How much longer can we realistically maintain this?" William asked. "That depends on several factors," Dr. Morrison replied. "If his condition remains stable at the current level, possibly months or even years. But if it progresses more rapidly, we may face difficult decisions much sooner." The conversation was interrupted by urgent news. A terrorist attack in London had killed 12 people and injured dozens more. This type of crisis required immediate royal response, including public statements, meetings with security officials, and careful coordination with the government's response. Dr. Morrison watched the king's handling of the crisis with particular attention. While he maintained his composure and delivered appropriate public statements, she could see the strain the emergency placed on his cognitive resources. He relied more heavily on written notes than usual and occasionally seemed uncertain about details that should have been second nature. "Events like this make me realize how precarious our situation really is," the king told Dr. Morrison privately after the immediate crisis had passed. "If I were to have a significant cognitive episode during a national emergency, the consequences could extend far beyond personal embarrassment." The terrorist attack had another unexpected consequence. It intensified media scrutiny of the royal family's activities and public statements. Several journalists noted that the king had seemed less spontaneous than usual in his responses, though they attributed this to the gravity of the situation rather than any health concerns. However, one persistent royal correspondent, James Mitchell from the Herald, had begun collecting instances where the king's behavior seemed slightly off. Mitchell had covered the royal family for 20 years and had developed a keen sense for when something was being concealed. "There's something different about His Majesty lately," Mitchell told his editor. "Nothing I can put my finger on exactly, but he seems less sharp than usual, more cautious in his responses, more dependent on his staff for prompts." This heightened media attention added a new layer of stress to an already difficult situation. The king's press secretary, working in coordination with Dr. Morrison and Prince William, began carefully managing the king's public appearances to minimize opportunities for cognitive lapses to be observed. As winter approached, the royal family faced a crucial decision point. The king's condition showed signs of gradual progression, and the stress of concealing his diagnosis was taking its toll on everyone involved. More importantly, they had discovered that their constitutional experts disagreed about the legal and ethical implications of their current approach. "Some argue that we have a duty to inform Parliament immediately," Sir Geoffrey reported during one of their private meetings. Others contend that as long as His Majesty retains sufficient capacity to fulfill his constitutional role, disclosure would cause unnecessary instability. The debate reflected a broader philosophical question about the nature of monarchy in the modern era. Was the sovereign primarily a symbol whose cognitive capacity was less important than continuity? Or did democratic principles require that the people know about any condition that might affect their head of state's decision-making abilities? "I keep thinking about the oath I took at my coronation," the king told Prince William during one of their evening conversations. "I swore to serve my people to the utmost of my ability. But what does that mean when my abilities are diminishing?" William had been struggling with the same questions from his perspective as heir apparent. Perhaps serving the people means ensuring a smooth transition when the time comes, rather than clinging to power beyond the point of effectiveness. These conversations marked a subtle shift in their discussions. Rather than focusing solely on concealing the king's condition, they began exploring how to manage a potential transition that would preserve the stability of the monarchy while respecting the nation's right to know about their sovereign's health. Dr. Morrison, meanwhile, had been consulting with international experts who had dealt with similar situations involving world leaders. Their guidance was sobering. Cognitive decline in heads of state, while not uncommon, was almost always handled poorly when it occurred, typically because the condition was concealed until it became impossible to hide. The most successful cases, she told the king, involved early disclosure and carefully managed transitions that prioritized institutional stability over individual pride. As they approached the first anniversary of the king's initial symptoms, all parties involved recognized that they were approaching a critical decision point. The question was no longer whether to reveal the king's condition, but when and how to do so in a way that would serve both the monarchy and the nation's interests. The crown had weathered many storms throughout its long history, but none quite like this, where the very mind that bore its weight was slipping away, and the challenge was not just managing the decline, but managing it in full view of a watching world.